Would you prefer this side?
This side, babe. Okay.
Buenos días. Bueno, ya Carmen nos ha presentado, pero me toca decir algo más sobre Phil Tinari. Phil Tinari, norteamericano de nacimiento, nació en Filadelfia y actualmente empezó como director del UCA, del Centro de Arte Contemporáneo chino, de arte chino, pero es CEO realmente de todo el grupo. Hoy día ya son 3 museos, no solo uno. Además de eso, ha sido editor, fundador de la revista Lip Magazine, de la edición china, de Art Forum, y es un escritor, es crítico de arte, es curator y, por supuesto, es experto en arte contemporáneo chino. Vive en Beijing desde 2001, si no estoy equivocado. Estudió en la Universidad de Duke, se licenció en literatura y posteriormente hizo un máster en Harvard, estudios asiáticos. Por supuesto, habla chino perfectísimamente, ¿no? Y aterrizó en aquel país con una beca Fulbright. Hay muchos datos sobre la excelente profesionalidad de Phil Tinari, y estos son datos que fácilmente se pueden obtener en Wikipedia, pero yo les puedo garantizar que además Phil Tinari pues es una interesante persona y es una excelente compañía.
16年来，有很多声音在这里响起，推开时光之门，他们再次于耳畔回响。
对 UCC 一定是开馆之前
这个中国艺术品市场会涉及到未来，
他们对作品最深刻、最本质的一个理解。
好，欢迎来到 UCC。
2007年 ，UCC 正式向公众开放。开馆展回顾了中国第一次当代艺术运动，这是首个直接展现这一历史时刻的美术馆展览。UCC 还推出一系列出版物，明确了致力于通过当代艺术推动中国更深入参与全球对话的机构定位。2008年 ，UCC 呈现首个艺术家大型个展。
我要找到一个相类似的一个飞机头，所以就形成了一个比如计划4。
同时开始为年轻艺术力量提供展示平台。2012年，在成立5周年之际 ，UCC 举办了首届 Callia， 这项每年一度的艺术盛会，由此成为中国艺术界社交日历上浓墨重彩的一笔。在不断前行和发展的过程中，越来越多具有划时代意义的展览在这里呈现。2018年 ，UCC 正式成为北京市文化局主管的民办非企业公益性美术馆，标志着机构转型过程中的重要一步。同年，北京尤伦斯艺术基金会在北京市民政局正式注册成为非营利性基金会。
那我们现在北京尤伦斯艺术基金会2个宗旨：学术和公益。
UCC 沙丘美术馆在北戴河阿那亚落成开馆。这是 UCC 在北京之外开设的首个分馆。2019年 ，UCC 完成对北京建筑空间的全面升级，展现了开放、包容、有趣的美术馆全新面貌。中国迄今为止最为全面的毕加索作品展开启。此后 ，UCC 陆续呈现诸多国际知名艺术家于中国的最全面个展。令观众有机会一睹艺术大师的非凡创作实践。2021年 ，UCC Edge 于上海苏州河畔落成开馆，上海艺术新地标在此绽放。2022年 ，UCC 团队策划了沙特阿拉伯首个当代艺术双年展——迪里耶当代艺术双年展，这也是 UCCA 在国际文化交流舞台上的又一次精彩亮相。16年来，UCC 始终关注本土艺术生态以及国际间的对话交流， 每年为超过100万的观众带来丰富的艺术展览、公共项目和研究计划的同时，还持续为儿童提供美术馆艺术教育，开发展览衍生品，积极探索艺术与品牌多元跨界合作。UCC 持续通过当代艺术推动中国更深入地参与到全球对话之中，立足自身使命，与时代发展同频共振，谱写全新篇章。持续在变幻的场域里，用心倾听这里的每一种声音，坚定履行机构使命，持续通过当代艺术促进文化交流，深入并改善人们的生活，持续以行动诠释始终不变的初心与理念，持续让好艺术影响更多人。
Fantastic. So coming back to the question,
Yes.
what does a Philadelphia boy to be so avidly interested in Chinese culture, Chinese art in general?
Yeah. Well, I came from a very humanities-focused background. I was educated in Philadelphia by the Jesuits, found my way to Duke, and was always in the kind of language, literature, history side of things. And China and Chinese language specifically seemed like an incredible challenge to take on. And it was the late 90s, and we were thinking a lot about globalization and new kinds of culture. And through my early study of Chinese, I got to know the artist Xu Bing, who was just in that video, one of the pioneers of contemporary Chinese art. And very quickly came to understand that contemporary Chinese art was somehow a crystallization of all these major questions in the world. I mean, in this one field, you see, the future of kind of the geopolitical order. You see all these questions about post-colonialism, about cultural exchange and autonomy. You see very old questions about the work of art and its presence and its power. And then from the early 2000s, when I started to live in China, I got very involved in the Chinese art world. I was a student, but on the weekends I would go and see these underground exhibitions. There was still not really a gallery, certainly not a museum scene yet. And I got to work on a number of important exhibitions, like the Triennial that happened in Guangzhou in 2002, which was really the first time that a lot of the experimental artists from the 1990s were allowed inside a state museum. And so, I was there as the translator because my language was kind of at that level, and I was always a lover of kind of writing and translating and editing. And so kind of at a very young age, I had this incredible, network of connections to all these artists. And then I went back to Harvard to study. And in those few years, that's when the Chinese art world really took off. And suddenly there was speculation, there were collectors, there were international museum groups coming. And this was the period right before the Olympics. And by the way, this is the period when UCCA is founded. And Guy and the late Miriam Ullins were, along with people like Wuli Sig, were really the key protagonists of this international interest in Chinese art. And suddenly this took the form of an institution. So I think it's so interesting to look back for me, because it's not only Italian-American guy from Philadelphia living in China, it's also when I started working in the field, it's not like you say, someday I hope I can be the director of MoMA. When I was starting to work in the field, UCCA didn't exist yet. And then we saw it take shape and go through the early pains of a new institution. And then it's now been 12 years of kind of trying to really every day make it a better place and a place that can, do more and be more to more people.
Yeah. Fully captivated by China.
Absolutely. Yeah, and also to enter the international art world, my whole career has been there. So my entry into the international art world has been from this place of China. Which I think also speaks to, we might think of China as closed off or foreign or remote, but it's a very cosmopolitan place in its own right. And I think, the fact that I've been able to work there, that, the leading institution is a place that was founded by Belgians. Yeah. Or you look at M+ in Hong Kong, with its collection donated by the former Swiss ambassador. You have these kind of seeds of very deep cultural exchange that run through contemporary art in China, and I think that bind China to the world in a way that you don't really see, in the same way in business or in diplomacy. Yeah.
Okay, let's say I think that you have some presentation about Yucca.
I do, but honestly, I'm happy to click through a little bit. I think the video ends up being a very good introduction because you see so much of it in just 2 minutes. But I would love to just explain a bit. I mean, I think it's interesting here. Carmen was just talking about patronage in Spain as maybe a phenomenon that's still taking shape. Completely foreign topic in China in the beginning. And just so people can understand, like, what is UCCA? It is these 3 places. They are different in their architectural character, ultimately in the kind of exhibitions that they present. But I think they're united by, it's one single curatorial team and artistic vision and mission and purpose that underlies it. So Beijing and Shanghai, people are familiar with. Beidaihe is the town about 300 kilometers from Beijing. If you were born in Beijing, it's probably the first place you saw the sea. It's the place where the senior leadership of the Communist Party goes for their summer retreat and meeting every year in August. And this area where UCCA Dune is located has become a very popular vacation destination. So, and then just to make clear, in addition to the museum cluster, UCCA also has these commercial elements which help to fund everything. So, I mean, I think the store is very self-explanatory. Every museum has one. Ours was always a platform for kind of new Chinese designers. Kids has been really great for us. We have a whole curriculum of art education that starts at age 2 and goes through age 12, and that a lot of parents really love because it's quite different from what the kids get in Chinese school. It's maybe not teaching painting and drawing, it's teaching more like how to think in the way of an artist and how to express oneself creatively. And so we have centers in Beijing and Shanghai for this, and then we take these curricula and through our UCCA Foundation, we export them, to other places in the country.
These are programs for family or students, from schools, or how?
Mostly, it's mostly happening on the weekends. They pay. It's an extracurricular. I mean, in China, you have parents filling their children's schedules with all kinds of different activities. But I think a lot of them feel like this is something that the kids really look forward to. So we start as young as 2, they come with their parents, and then go all the way up through. In
our case, in the Thyssen in Madrid, for instance, so kids are coming since 3 years on. So imagine.
It's incredible.
That's perfect because they enjoy a lot. So it's incredible to see them, how quiet they are, how enjoy. So, and it's important to have that experience with the parents as well, because I think it's a way to make more consistent the interest of not only of the kids, but
I agree completely.
The whole family.
And especially in China, because contemporary art is maybe a newer field, a newer topic. And so you have a lot of parents who are quite curious, and they kind of use their kids as a way to ask questions, maybe that they're embarrassed to ask themselves. So we really like that.
It's like gambling, like playing a game.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then just a word on this UCCA Lab. This is this platform we established that's doing art-related projects for all kinds of great brands and enterprises throughout China. And this has grown to become a little more than half of our annual revenue. So many of the projects that Lab does, they're coming from a commercial starting point. So it's like the outdoor brand Arc'teryx or Huawei or BMW come to us and say, we'd like to do something with Chinese art. It's a whole curatorial process. And then often the final result, it never happens in the museum. It always happens, happens in cities around China. It happens online. It happens in alternative kinds of spaces. But actually, because it's a way to mobilize our network of young artists and to actually give them work, which can be, especially during the pandemic, honestly, it was great.
Young artists and the interest of young people as well.
Exactly. I mean, this word lab, it's like experimental. It's often doing things that we maybe wouldn't think to do in the museum, and sometimes with technology.
I think particularly the lab spaces, the lab area, it's a magnificent tool to connect art with other interests of the community, of the society. Because art, it's not an isolated thing or something to do just with artists, but it's a way of expression, of communication, of identifying, of debating, focusing on many of the things that the people is interested or concerned about.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that this line between, just to go into the weeds a little bit about organization, when UCCA was set up, when Mr. Uhlin set up UCCA in 2005, he established a company to organize it, and the opening of the building was in 2007. He actually went to the Ministry of Culture and said, I'd like to start a museum, how should I do that? And the people at the ministry said, please don't try to do it as a nonprofit, because we will have no idea how to regulate you. Yeah. They said, start a company. So we were, for the first 10 years, a money-losing company.
It's a way to be a non-profit.
And then we can click ahead. I mean, well, you see, this is sort of the history. So what I'm talking about is basically the first two phases. Yeah. You know, and it's really interesting because in each phase, it's always the same building, but it's been a different facade, and it kind of mirrors how the place has grown. So when we were first founded, you know, we had this wonderful director, Jérôme Sans. We had, you know, very ample exhibition budgets, lots of interest, but there were very few viewers, because the idea of an art institution in an old factory district and on the outskirts of Beijing was not quite, you know, the world wasn't ready for it yet. And it was only in 2017 when, after 10 years, Mr. Uhlin's decided that he was ready to move on. He was well into his 80s. And what we did was we brought together a number of our patrons, and we bought it from him and reorganized. And because when this happened, we were now seen no longer as being foreign, but as being Chinese. Yeah. And so the government allowed us to register as a museum. I mean, we still have the company. That's what we use for lab, for kids, for these other things. But we have, when we sell tickets to the museum, for example, we don't have to pay tax on that revenue. Yeah. And we also set up a nonprofit foundation attached to the museum, and that can donate money into the museum. So it's a model we've really had to make up as we've gone along, and that I think it has interesting ideas for people in other parts of the world, but it's also very specific to this context, because in China, you know, either you're part of the state, you're the National Museum, you're the Beijing City Museum, or you're private enterprise. And there's really not, you know, in that American way of like, here's the Guggenheim as a tax-exempt foundation held by a fiduciary board who are responsible for its governance and for its mission and for its feasibility, but they're not the owners. Yeah. I mean, in the end, in China, so who owns it is really the question. And so actually having these different shareholders has been a way around some of these questions, and then creating the framework to continue to do, you know, good work.
So at the end of the day, it can be said that actually that transition has represented a number of benefits for the organization. Hmm?
Yeah, absolutely.
Economical, well, in terms of participation as well, fiscality.
Yeah, I mean, it forced us to become much more creative. In the first few years, it was 100% funded by Mr. Uhlin's. I joined 4 years in, at exactly the moment when he was starting to say, this is great, but, you know, I think any private museum, you know, maybe for the first few years, it's going to be most of the money coming from the person whose name is on the door.
And I guess that maybe, well, if Mr. Uhlin expect to, I mean, thinking of this like a business, and I don't know if he'd respond in terms of profitability as the model he expected, or the way he expected. So maybe this was one of the reasons he decided to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bigger question. It was actually quite complicated, because he was, as Simone will know very well, he was building a collection. He built a really significant collection, and then in due course he sold that collection, and did quite well, because he did this all at a very important time for the market. But all of that activity really had nothing to do with UCCA. If you made one big spreadsheet and you put the cost of the art here, and then you considered the cost of the museum really as like a marketing expense, actually he still did fine. But then if you take just the museum and you need to make the museum break even, then you have to change your approach, you know, entirely. That's the time we come from, you know, the excitement around China. This we saw the early years, you know, some of these great shows. And then this is when I joined. This is the second phase, where we were trying to figure out how to move away from just being supported by one patron, and how to really, you know, and a big part of that was building connections to the community, because in the beginning we were seen as quite foreign, you know, we were seen as European. But then, you know, after a certain amount of time, you become more and more recognized by the local population. So this was important, because this meant moving the entrance, it had been in this sort of dark corridor, and you would go down this almost like secret passage and suddenly find yourself in this very luxurious space. And in the first 5 years, one thing was that UCCA became more public and more popular. The other thing was that contemporary art and the 798 zone where we're located became, destinations. And so suddenly we said we should be present on the street in this way, and that was what that was about.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the most brilliant aspects of the work was always from the outset. I mean, try to make understand the West of the world, that contemporary Chinese art, because until now, so what at this side of the world we were more familiar to was with ancient art, ancient artists, China.
Yes.
But I think that role, trying to make understand better both sides, so the Chinese in Western and vice versa. So it's one of your challenges. I think that, particularly in ancient art, so there is some barriers to make this understanding. I mean, some cultural barriers. It's hard for Chinese people to understand the ancient artists, Western artists, because obviously, so we have an iconography, a code of communication, a language, a story. So our pictures are telling some stories which are known to us, but known to them, and it passes as well on the contrary. So you think that focusing on contemporary art, it's something easier to make? I mean, because of the conceptuality of the contemporary art, maybe it could be easier to that common understanding in both ways? Or
I think I think absolutely. And I think what happened was that after 1989, which was such a huge year for the whole world, you start to have this idea of global contemporary art. It began with things like the show that Jean-Hubert Martin did at the Pompidou called Magicien de la Terre. Suddenly this idea that contemporary art, which really comes from modernism and through conceptualism and pop, but as it kind of takes shape in the 80s and into the 90s, is suddenly like a global language, right? Of course, there have been conceptual art as far back as really the post-war period and sometimes before in different contexts. But it was only, I think, in the 90s that the art world started to look beyond Europe and America, and artists from other parts of the world. I mean, Huang Yongping, who was in that video, is a great example. Chinese-born artist. He passed away in 2019, but in 1989, he came to Paris to be in that show, Magicien de la Terre, and he never left. And so he was this, and there were a whole number of them, these Chinese artists who were present, and they were in all the important biennales, and they were doing major commissions and projects. And I think together and we built this world where, of course, anything that's shown in this contemporary context will have some layer of cultural reference that you may or may not belong to you may or may not understand. But I think the idea is that it should be, if not accessible, like legible, and should be, you should be able to kind of get there. I mean, this is William Kentridge, whose show we did in 2015, the great South African artist. There are these points of connection. So why did we do this show? This is an artist who did something very unfashionable when he began his career in the 80s, which was figurative drawing. And he was doing figurative drawing because South Africa at that time was under kind of cultural boycott, or at the end of apartheid. And so he wasn't really seeing, the latest trends in other parts of the world. It gave him somehow the courage to do these, the figurative things. And then he built a language from there that talks about history and trauma and societies and transition and all these things. And I just thought that story was so relevant to China because, in China you have artists who are trained at the highest levels in the figurative tradition and who in earlier generations were likewise not synced up to the global conversation, but then suddenly there they are on this global stage and platform and with something to say. And so I thought there was a real resonance and a similarity, that could be useful to explore.
Mm-hmm. Well, however, I think the interest in art in general, from my experience the last year in Shanghai with the exhibition of the Thyssen collection was fantastic because actually, I mean, it's not contemporary art. I mean, it's ancient and modern arts, but it was amazing, the response of the people, young people, and interested in knowing more about this. Well, I suppose that we are now more open world with much more things in common.
Yeah, no, I'm going to skip ahead to an image from a little bit later. But we were actually in competition one day in June because the exhibition from Thyssen-Bornemisza opened at Museum of Art Pudong on, I think it was June
I don't remember.
12th, maybe, something like that.
Yeah.
It was the same day that we opened a different exhibition, which was the collection of the Museum Berggruen from Berlin.
Yes.
Same day in Shanghai. So you had these two collections, and the Berggruen collection, it's Picasso, Klee, Giacometti, Matisse, and we hung it in rigid chronological order by the creation of the work. So this is how it looked in Beijing. It just ended a few days ago. But it was incredible because if you were a young student in Shanghai, you could go on the same day to see the highlights of the Thyssen collection, the highlights of the Berggruen collection, and there were 5 other shows at that. I mean, it was a little bit of the COVID backlog, so suddenly all the shows happened in 2023. But it's also, and I think this is really the important point, is that in these past few years, people like to talk about how China has become more repressive, things have become more centralized under the leadership, all of that, which is true. Yeah. But what's also happened is that because you've had 40 years of economic development, despite what's happening today in the real estate market, you have now generations of younger, middle-aged people who feel deeply about art and love art and need it in their lives. And that base, the number of those people, first in the major cities, now in the second and third tier cities, and really it expands and it won't stop expanding. Yeah. It grows so much every year. So you said you had 500,000 people coming to the show in
almost half a million people
so we didn't do quite that well, but
that's quite well. No, for us it was we were very happy. So I see that particularly happens in Shanghai. I don't know Beijing as well as Shanghai. Yeah. But well, you have said that there are 3 different museums, the same purpose, obviously. But what would you say it's the peculiarity, the particularity, which makes each one different to the others? So
of the venues.
Yeah, the venues.
Yeah. Well, so Beijing we've talked about a lot. I just clicked through the images, but it's really, the amazing thing. These are all images from Beijing. Our main space there is called the Great Hall, and you can kind of see it's a factory chamber, 68 meters by 28 meters, 9 meters tall, no columns. So it's an empty, it's a blank canvas, and you can really do anything. This is the young Chinese artist Cao Fei who turned it into a city. Yeah. This was an incredible show. The only problem was it was during COVID, so very few people from outside China got to see it with a mezzanine. You can do, this incredibly contemporary Picasso show, Xu Bing. So this is the regeneration that was done by OMA, the Dutch firm, to really connect the whole space. So it's quite open, but it's inside what's called an art zone. So it's in a 798. It's this compound of former factories that since the early 2000s has been a place for art and for artists. So people who come here know that they're coming to see art. Yeah. Whereas in Shanghai, we're just at the intersection of 2 important metro lines, and we are in a part of the city that's rapidly revitalizing by the shore of the Suzhou Creek. And we're actually over 3 floors of an office building. The rest of the building is AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical company. But UCCA is just one short escalator from the subway. And we worked with a brilliant New York architect called Soil to convert the space, to take 3 floors of pretty basic commercial space and try to turn it into a museum. I'm sorry to click so rapidly. I'm just trying to show you where we are.
Well, this is
so, but maybe we'll talk about this first. Yeah, this is. This is the gem because this is one of the great Chinese architects of the moment called Open, and the protagonist is a guy called Li Hu. He was the protege of Stephen Hall, so he's always been. Even in the early 2000s, they had a magazine called New York Beijing. So he's always in this, very much like UCCA, back and forth, and he had this crazy dream to build a museum buried under a sand dune.
But that's a sample of sustainability as well, because that integration into nature, so it's fantastic as well. I think
We love it. And the thing is, it's not big. It's only about 660 square meters of space.
Yeah.
And you cannot fight the building. When I curated a show at the Guggenheim in 2017, one of the first things people said was every show at the Guggenheim has a fourth curator, or third or fourth curator, and his name is Frank Lloyd Wright. Right? I think it's quite similar. You're always in this building, in this architecture, but the trade-off is that you can come from the galleries and emerge onto the sea. That's before the vegetation grew.
Yes.
And then you get these really wonderful, it needs a haircut in this image, but so you enter through this tunnel and then you find yourself.
That vegetation did exist when you start the works of the museum, or it's something that you have integrated, so it's a way to put that green space there, because I have seen some pictures which it looks like sand, pure sand, a big beach.
No, the idea was always it should grow back.
Yeah.
But some of the early pictures, it's looking a bit sandy, and in the winter, it's not as green. But I think it's the best in the summer when you have like that image where you have the blue, the yellow of the sand, the white of the building, the green of the vegetation. No, it's really something quite unique.
Carmen, nos quedan 5 minutos. Okay. Well, so time flies. Yeah. So I said it's very interesting to have a chat with you.
Likewise.
Well, there is something that I would like to, maybe it's an uncomfortable question, but it's about censorship. I suppose Chinese, it's not, I know it's not like working in New York, Madrid, or any other place. So I think that ability you shows when you have to play with all these things. It's like an exercise of compliance versus defiance. Yeah. So how do you do that?
Yeah. The good thing, well, not the good thing, but let's say, first of all, it's a daily part of our institutional practice. It's something you cannot get around. And it's something that's become more difficult in recent years. And when I first started, there were gray zones, and often you could show works that were quite subversive, but maybe they were a little bit hard to understand, and you could get away with it. And that felt really cool and really dangerous. And actually, in the recent years, the government has gotten smarter. And it's also just digital technology. The process. You submit everything online through this platform, and in the beginning, you could submit tiny thumbnail images, and now you have to submit high-resolution images. And if there's text, you need to submit the translation. So it's a very almost like scientific process, and there's negotiation.
Dedicated.
You have to, and it's everything. It's even Matisse. It's even, and it's. It's just part of the reality, If you work in this place, this is something you must accept. I guess what I want to say is that we try always to push up against the line, because if you're not pushing to the line, you don't know where it is. So I always, if you have some works removed, in a way, that's the sign that you're doing your job well. And you go and fight for them, and maybe you get a few more through, but still there's a few you cannot show. And it's just, you have to have that kind of like fighting spirit, I think, to keep going.
I think you are very creative, seeking solutions for this, because the exhibitions of the photographer Terry Simon, which was very evident. That censorship there with those blacks of pictures. But it was fantastic, because in some way it's a way to demonstrate, to show off that here exists the censorship. But without saying that, and nobody speak about that. So it's a masterclass of how to do that. Huh?
It's definitely one of the more difficult things about the context. But I think this comes to this question of like, should we then say that people who are not fortunate enough to live in a democratic society do not deserve to have art? If you kind of take that thinking to the end, and I think instead, people come down on both sides. Some people would say, I refuse to work in this context, like Highway, right, or many others, and I respect that. deeply. I mean, it can be a very principled stand. We've taken a different stand, which is let's see what we can do in this context where we find ourselves, and what are the possibilities and the potentialities of that.
Thank you. I don't know if that's it. So maybe you want to add something.
No, I think we've covered as much ground as possible in 40 minutes. And no, I'm really I'm very grateful. It's been such a warm welcome to get to know a bit the Callia Foundation and the incredible work that they're doing. So thank you for this kind invitation and for bringing me into this circle of really wonderful friends.
Thank you. And for me, it was an honor to have this opportunity with you. Thank you.